Today, I'm very excited to welcome Neil King Jr., celebrating the release of American Ramble, a walk of memory and renewal. Neil King Jr.'s desire to walk from Washington, D.C. to New York City began as a whim and soon became an obsession. By the spring of 2021, events such as the January 6th insurrection, COVID lockdowns, and a rancorous erection had deepened America's divides, while Neil's own long battle with cancer had impacted him. Neil King is the Wall Street Journal's global economics editor. Mr. King has worked for 15 years in the journal's Washington bureau, where he has covered beats ranging from terrorism and foreign policy to trade and the international oil industry. He served as a national political reporter from 2010 until early 2014, when he took over as editor of the journal's economic coverage. He did freelance reporting for the European Journal from Prague from 1993 to 1994. Born in Colorado, Mr. King earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Columbia University in New York and a master's degree from the Meadow Graduate School of Journalism at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. King will be joined in conversation by Helene Cooper, a New York Times Pentagon reporter and author of the best-selling memoir, The House at Sugar Beach, In Search of a Lost African Childhood. Her work in Liberia covering the Ebola epidemic was part of a package that won the Pulitzer Prize. Her most recent book is Madam President, The Extraordinary Story of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Please join me in welcoming Neil King Jr. and Helene Cooper.
Hello. Neil, what are you doing?
Getting some. Oh, I have water.
You have water.
Hello. I know a fair number of people, but I'm glad to know that there's a lot of people I don't know. So it's not just my friends.
Hi. Thank you guys for joining us on this beautiful spring Sunday afternoon. And welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm really happy to be here with my friend Neil King for a discussion of his wonderful book, American Ramble, A Walk of Memory and Renewal. For all of the more than 25 years that I've known Neil, I've thought of him as my brother from another mother. But then when he told me that he was going to walk to New York from Washington, I realized there was no way we could be related. I couldn't get my head around what he was doing, but then he started writing on social media these dispatches from the road, and I realized that Neil was not on just a walk. He was on a Canterbury Tales-esque journey through America. His book made me proud. It made me curious, and most of all, it made me absolutely euphoric. I'm so happy that I get to share this space with Neil on this beautiful day to talk about what I think is a seminal achievement from my beloved friend.
Thank you so much.
So, Nilski, you want to say something before I start asking questions?
You have to be careful because I could just start rambling.
I'll interrupt you.
All right. I will say this, that I'm incredibly thankful and grateful for being here and seeing all these faces, and for you being here to talk to me about this book. As was said at the beginning, it did start out as a bit of a joke to myself and something that kind of repelled most people when they first heard about it, and then it became gradually something else. But let's get to your questions.
Excellent. So we're in Washington, D.C., so most of the people here can imagine what your row house on 9th Street and Capitol Hill looks like. It's April 2021, 9 days before the start of spring, as you write, and you kiss Shayla goodbye, sling your backpack onto your back, and walk out onto the streets of your neighborhood. What the hell are you thinking in that moment?
You know, one thing that's really sunk into my mind since doing it was the vital importance of having walked out my own door. And to the extent that I'm now become a kind of advocate for others doing something similar, should they be so inclined, the walking out your own door towards a place that's of significance to you, having spent a lot of time thinking about the land in between and studying the stories in between and the geology in between, the whole of it creates a continuum that was so important to me in the whole of the walk, because it was very much of a walk out my door into the story of our country, and through a part of it where a good portion of the founding and some of its most seminal turmoil-ridden stories had taken place. And I just want to, the other thing I'll just say about the departing is I think in part because of a certain almost like mental preparation, I walked out my door in such a way that it was different than the other times I'd walked out my door. And it was with almost a self-granted permission to be astonished and amazed by what I was going to encounter, which I think is a freedom we don't often grant ourselves, to not think that we've already seen everything already. And I was going out my door as if I had seen none of it before.
And on the mechanics of it, though, on you're walking by your neighbor's house, are you immediately thinking, I'm tired already? How long? I'm trying to think about when I go off for a walk, or when I, in the past when I used to try to run, and the first few miles were always the hardest. Was there any of that to this, or is there a spring in your step at that point?
Well, there was very much spring in my step. I'll just say that I went, just for the practicalities, the intention all along, I was not going to camp in the woods. I had already discounted that. I was not going to do that. I left with about 17 pounds in a backpack. I knew where I was going to stay. The first night I stayed in Olney at a house that had been lived in by Harold Ickes during the Second World War, and I actually slept in the bedroom that FDR had used when he was there through that time. And that was actually one of the most difficult days, because it was about 24 miles. I walked to see Abe Lincoln, which felt mandatory to me, and then I basically took a right and went straight up Rock Creek Park. And we live in an extraordinary city. One of the things that's quite amazing about it is you can leave the whole of it going north up a creek and barely see a car or a house. But that in itself was a demanding day, and I sort of had crept out of the outer edges of Washington for that first night. But just in terms of the conditioning, anybody that does an Appalachian Trail hike or anything like that will tell you that you condition while doing it. So the first few days were the hardest in that way, but they got much easier as I went.
I want to get to a little bit of the walk outside of Washington, because we're here in Washington. But before we get to that, one of the things about your book that I was oddly fascinated about are, again, getting to the mechanics of the walk. Can you talk about what you packed, for instance? You said you had 17 pounds on your back, in your backpack. You slept at inns along the way, so you're not taking a sleeping bag with you. But what did you decide to take with you? How do you walk us through that?
Yeah, I had a laptop, which was the heaviest thing I had. I had a few changes of clothes, but all clothes that you could wash in the bathtub at night and dry overnight. I had the single pair of shoes I had on. I had one collapsible fly rod.
You walked to New York with one pair of shoes. I think I remember when we get to, there are points later on in the but what were you thinking? Is it because shoes are heavy, or what?
I didn't need dress shoes. Exactly.
I know, but it's like, so you think, but yeah. even if your shoes are like the most well-worn, comfy shoes that you could possibly have, after like 10 days, you're gonna want a different pair.
Well, I didn't bring my cozy bedroom slippers. If that's what you're
asking. You didn't bring the Pradas either.
I didn't need any. I had a fly rod and a few things. I actually, oddly enough, brought some little neoprene waders, because I did do some fishing along the way, but I was super spare, and I had a couple of very thin books.
And how did you carry your water?
I had a water bladder that I would use occasionally. Otherwise, I had a water jug like that.
Did you make a point of saying, I have to have at least 40 ounces of water with me at all times?
Well,
were you like rationing
yes
that?
and no. There was one of the portions I like early on in the book was what I called the parable of the empty water bottle when I ran out of water. And I had to ask a man, and he wouldn't give me water.
I remember that guy. He was mean. All right. So stealing away on a long walk like this is not easy. You write about that in the second chapter. I'd like you to read a little bit. Let's go to page 20. The parts that begin with "As I got up to leave."
So this actually was, I was still in Rock Creek, and I had sat and had lunch with Gardner Harris, who happens to be right over there, who I left out of the book, by the way. I apologized to him yesterday. I said it wasn't time to introduce a new character. As I got up to leave from the lunch with Gardner that I didn't mention, I stood to watch the river flow and bend around the rocks and thought about how any of us managed to seize our most magical stretches, our extended periods of maximum freedom. Fishermen work seams between slow water and fast, between deep water and shallow, between sunlight and shadow. The eddies around rocks, the bubble lines along the banks, that's where the fish are. Grabbing long moments like this walk is also a matter of playing the seams. It's a matter of timing. All of us have little fissures in our lives that provide us greater than normal moments of freedom. You play the seams when you identify those moments and seize them. That window between high school and college, immediately after college, coming out of the army, moving between houses or states or continents, changing jobs, after a breakup or divorce, having your kids move out of the house, recovering from an illness that realigns your bearings. Events are moments that cause a break in the regular order and open fissures through which we can slip into a different place. We talk about freedom of choice, but we don't often enough talk about how freedom itself is a choice. We have enormous powers beyond our day-to-day reckoning, to create our own reality. Americans have it wrong when it comes to what Emerson or others meant when they talked about self-reliance. It wasn't the ability to live deep in the woods and eat what you kill. It was about the faith to rely on your own instincts and live by your own lights. That is the truest form of self-reliance. If only for a moment I had broken the inertial bonds, and as I kept going upriver, every inch of me was glad for the movement.
I always forget how good a writer you are. But it's not just that you're a great writer, you're just like really smart. And this is the last time I'll ever say that to you. So again, because, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I'd like you to go into more detail of it because we're here in Washington. We're at the starting point of this wonderful endeavor. You tell us a little bit about your walk out of our beautiful city. You basically walk north along Rock Creek, which all I know about Rock Creek is that there's a parkway there. So how does one walk north out of Washington, D.C., going along Rock Creek? What do you see? What does the city look like?
You know, I just walked up, actually much farther up Rock Creek than I ever had, to where it, departs the city itself and kind of leaves the canyon that it kind of has when it's in the city.
So the creek is going along next to Rock Creek Parkway, right?
Yeah, and as people know who live in that area, there's a bike path and there's all kinds of things up there. And I walked, well into the afternoon along the creek until I finally had to cut out of it. And then I got along Georgia Avenue, as I recall, where Georgia Avenue gets quite wide, not the Georgia Avenue like it is near the White House. And it was actually in the end Georgia Avenue that took me out of the city the next day and then became a very small kind of highway, 2-lane highway. But it was fascinating, and I described this some in the book. One of the many, many merits of walking is that you get this kind of detailed sense of how the city has these sort of rings and where the well-off people live and then where the people live who assist and look after the properties of the well-off people. I walked through whole neighborhoods that were filled with pickup trucks and various things that were kind of the service people's neighborhoods. And then by the next day, I was, actually finally when the city gave way, I was in kind of the horse farm country. And it was just so interesting to watch that evolution of rings of the city. And it was one of the great merits of walking. I saw that kind of thing as I went all along the way. And just to go back to the beginning of walking out my door, I had many motives in taking this walk. Some of them were the national story and all the horrors that we had seen the year before, and trying to kind of come to some hazy conclusion about where we're heading as a country and all of that. But the main motive was really, or the main intention was just to pay attention. And there's a great line that I love from Mary Oliver. She says, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." And it was really my walking out my door to pay attention was the beginning of my exercise in paying devotion to what it is I was going to see.
So you had mentioned earlier that your first night was at Harold Ickey's house, which is an easy commute for anybody sitting here right now. It's like, what, you said 24 miles from here. Presumably you walk 24 miles, or from Capitol Hill. If you drove to Olney, Maryland, it would take, what, 20 minutes?
No, it'd probably take about 50, maybe, something like that, depending on which way you went. Yeah.
So when you arrive at this house, this is your first night. This is the first night of your big endeavor. Are you excited, or are you thinking, what have I gotten myself into?
I never had that moment of what had I gotten myself into. I was absolutely overjoyed to be doing this thing. I mean, I arrived at this place. It's this huge Doric pillared mansion, actually the largest Sears house ever built in the country, which has a long story as to why that's the case. And these two women who owned it at the time, they've since sold it. They hadn't had a guest for 2 months because of COVID.
Oh, this is the warm rosé wine.
Yeah, they were so overjoyed, and I badly needed a drink. Not that I'm, an alcoholic, but geez, I'd walked 24 miles, And so I said, "Do you all have anything to drink here?" And neither of them were drinkers, but she had some wine left over from the previous year, and she pulled this big bottle of rosé out, and then she gave me a tall glass filled with ice, and I was like, perfect. So I just sat there reading Harold Ickey's memoirs in this great dining room, in the study where he and FDR had played poker and whatnot, and drinking this rosé on the rocks. We have a long way to go, though. We're only at the first night.
I know. I'm moving it along. I'm going to jump now. Another part of your book that I loved is when you cross the Mason-Dixon Line. And that, again, is so much a part of where we live. That's one of the things I loved about the book. Is so much of it is, it is the life that we all inhabit here where we live. And I think about the Mason-Dixon Line, quite often, but you dwelled on it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Again, evangelizing on the value of doing this kind of thing, even if you were just to go up and park 5 miles away from the Mason-Dixon Line and walk up to it and then look along it. I was just astonished by that afternoon. Walking up all these various lanes that one went to the other. I'm sure they were basically the same roads that had existed when that line was the demarcation line that it was. And all these very old stone houses along the way, all the roads named after mills or inns or runs or all the kind of, ancient street roads, the street names. And coming to the line itself, which of course separates the two states, and for a while it was the highway. And I walked down it, and there was a cemetery that sprawled across both sides of the road. And then just as the road bent, I looked down, and instead of what it had been the tarmac road became a dirt road, and it went down right into this farmhouse. And I sort of snuck down. This was a farmhouse that had been basically abandoned, but it was a beautiful place, and it had been clearly built in like the 1820s. I later found out it had been built by a German family that had come there. And what was so striking is that the line went literally right under the front porch, and it was this beautiful, very proudly built, field stone style house. And because no one was there, I had the privilege, even though I suppose I was trespassing, to wander around and really check out the barn and the design of the barn and how each of the hinges on the doors of the barn were all different and had all been forged probably by the guy himself, I don't know. But, it was a place that told such a story of ambition of the people that had arrived and all of that. And yet, he and his wife could have stood on the porch on the free part, allegedly free part of the country during that whole stretch of time, looking just 5 feet away to another part of the country that lived by an entirely different set of rules. I had a discussion with David Axelrod the other day, and he brought up the house divided cannot stand, and this was itself sort of a house divided by a border. But it was a great hour spent just kind of meditating about the significance of this weird hypothetical line that had been once such a gash in the country, and then just this house that said had sort of told its own story.
At this point, you've decided that you're going to write a book about this, or is it still something that you're just doing?
You know, the idea was never a book idea. I didn't say, oh, I really need to write a book. Oh, what if I walked to New York and wrote a book about it? It was, the idea had its own origins, but by the time I walked out the door, I was very much going to write a book about it, and I had spent a lot of time. I'd already, I think, done a fair bit studying who Mason was, who Dixon was, how they came, why they came, all that kind of stuff. One of the mottos I gave to myself was, this prior, and I do this pretty much whenever I travel now, the more study and reading you do before you go to a place, you bring meaning with you. The place pays back in kind much more if you bring the meaning with you. And that kind of exchange, meaning for meaning, I think is really vital, and it made a huge difference for me because everywhere I went, I brought a lot of meaning with me, and it gave back so much more in return.
This is the perfect segue then to what I wanted to ask you next, which is I've always considered the Mid-Atlantic to be the only place in the country I think that I could actually live. But I've also always thought it was kind of boring. But as I was reading your book, and you get to places like York, and it just popped into my head because this was just, you took this walk just months after that horrible summer of 2020 when we all watched Hamilton, which is basically what I did because it was available on Disney Plus. And it felt as if you were walking through the entire Hamilton script in some ways. It was like a cool version of it. Have you always been a history buff? I think I know the answer to that, but I want you to tell people. And did you set out to see specific places throughout in our history as you did this walk, or did these places just sort of come and see you?
I very intentionally went to see certain things and guided my path accordingly. For instance, when I got across the Mason-Dixon Line, I then wanted to go up now it's called a rail trail, but it was actually one of the first railroads built in the United States, went from Baltimore up to York. And there was a station, which Aaron Zittner, sitting right here, was with me when I got to that station, was one of the destinations, which was this place called Hanover Junction Station. And it was such a fascinating place to me for just two moments that it had in its history, which was in November of 1863. Lincoln had come there on his way to Gettysburg, and the Hanover Junction Station meant that he went this way on this track to go to Gettysburg. But first he stopped at that station for 45 minutes for other reasons. And a year and a half later, he came on this other track going north on the way to his burial, and also paused at that same station. And that in itself, those two facts just gave the place a kind of resonant meaning to me. And I, stopped there, and we've thought about that, talked about it. I later wanted that, to be also a portal through which I could write a bit about those things. But all the way along, in terms of being a history buff, yes and no. The one thing that was such a great thing about the walk was that it gave me an excuse to really understand a lot of these things that I hadn't understood before. I didn't have a great depth of knowledge about the state of Pennsylvania, for instance, which I've come now to understand how we would not be the same country if it had not been for the phenomenon of the state of Pennsylvania, for William Penn, for the Quakers, for the people that state drew to it. Profoundly different story than any other state in the country. And, in terms of what do you figure you already know, one of the kind of miraculous stretches was when I got to Lancaster County, and, any of us have probably driven through that area, and you've been maybe a little irked because you've had to slow down because of buggies in front of you or whatever. The Mennonites, the Amish, they're there. But again, my attitude was sort of say, wait a minute, why are these people here and what are they doing here? And it's so extraordinary that a seething tempest of events in the early 1500s created all these various offshoots because of the Reformation, many of which then found refuge in the United States and in particular in Pennsylvania. And in the case of the Anabaptists, this experiment that they started in 1525 is still going on. It's the only thing even remotely like that in all of America, except for maybe, I think of like the Pueblo Indians in parts of Arizona and New Mexico, are about the only sort of extant ongoing civilization like that. And, you know, I was up there this last week, and I spent an evening with a bunch of these Mennonite families that I'd met. And it's just so extraordinary to see how these are people, really in some ways, in the best of ways, that are still living in a different era. I came out of the school after I'd talked to a bunch of them, and to see how all the kids had just broken into these spontaneous games of volleyball, even though it was like late dusk and they were playing kickball. And I was like, is this the 1950s or something? I mean, you know, where if I had been in a kind of modern, so-called modern setting, all the kids would have been essentially looking at their phones. And this kind of diversity is just out there in sort of striking ways if you go out and look for it.
That's what, I mean, that again, that gets to what I found so cool about it. This is like, you're writing about my home, and it's like I go through, how many times do we all drive through Pennsylvania? And we know that all of this is there, but we don't absorb it, you know, the way that you did. So there are many occasions, though, when you insert yourself into other people's spaces, something that might cause some of us, like me or Black guy, to think twice. You talk about the privilege that allows that to happen. For instance, a Black man would think twice before barging into a Mennonite horseshoer's barn, as you do in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there are many occasions where I write about the whole concept of privilege, and one of them was just, there was a moment when I'm walking along in Lancaster County, and I saw a sign that said horseshoeing. And then I heard someone horseshoeing on his property, and I walk up his drive, and I just walk into the barn, and the guy has the horse's hoof in his lap, and he turns to me and he says, well, what do we have here? And I introduced myself. I sat down. I spent 45 minutes with him talking about horseshoeing. And I write a little bit about the oddity of being here. The feeling that you belong where you are is the ultimate human privilege, the state we all yearn to achieve as we go forward. That sense of being at ease in the place where you stand, that you are respected and trusted and not looked down upon, that you share with the people around you a common sense of relevance, a mutual caring for the other's well-being, maybe even a similar purpose, or at the least a basic feeling of welcomeness, as Matt Strawn, the farrier, had extended his welcome without pause or hesitation when I came through his door. Ideally, we learn to expand our sphere of belonging well beyond our family, our clan, our tribe, or political party, or village, or sports team, or national identity. When that happens, belonging becomes a transportable state of mind, something that you take with you as you roam. Belonging is something you do, you belong, but also something you have, like a cherished item you can hold in your hand. He arrived with his few belongings on his back. The best way to get people to think you belong in the pool hall, the bar, the Mennonite schoolhouse, or the barn with the bearded auctioneer while the snow blows horizontally outside is for you to feel like you belong there yourself. The most durable form of belonging starts, oddly, with solitude. The better you are at being alone, the more comfortable you are as you go, and the more effortlessly you belong in the places where you arrive. At the same time, you treat the people you meet as if they also belong as part of your world, that they are themselves a part of your walk.
That's so interesting. It's in many ways, is it in some ways the opposite of what you did as a journalist? Because often when we as reporters go into something, we want to stand out, you know?
Yeah, but it's, you know, in terms of how I did this, and people have asked me, could this or that person do this? And I would argue that a lot of people, that if anyone who is inclined, predisposed to want to do something like this, I think could do it. But that said, being a reporter for the length of time I was, and yourself, you still are, trains you. So we're really good, and I worked overseas as you did, and talked to a lot of people, including in places where I didn't speak their language. So it makes those kinds of encounters a lot more effortless, right?
But did you ever think, as you're walking into these places, if I were a black guy, they would pull out a gun?
I did. I thought a lot about that. And, I write about it in with the same guy who didn't want to fill my water bottle, and he was advising me to be careful in his neighborhood because some people might wonder why I was there in the first place. And, I can kind of shrug that off, but there are other people that would not be inclined to shrug that off, and they shouldn't.
We got to talk about the landfill.
Yeah,
There's no way I'm gonna not ask you about this. Everybody in this room has driven past it, and I confess that chapter 21, Cresting the Great Mound, is one of my favorites in the entire book. I read your manuscript more than a year ago, and I'm still haunted by one phrase that you had in there, the line about how this guy's, every time we buy that stupid plastic milk jug, this is where it's ending up. Can you tell us a little bit about why you put the landfill on your itinerary? Why was it a destination?
In a funny way, this whole book is kind of a book about time. And if any of you read it sort of with that in mind, you'll see what I'm talking about. And some of it, I, just by way of background, had my own time scare, in that 4 years before I set out, I had a diagnosis that threatened for a while to deprive me of the whole of my 60s and everything that might have come after. And that readjusted my own sense of time. And as I describe a bit at the start of the book, I kind of went out to look at all the various things that keep time. Rivers are a kind of timekeeper. Houses that aren't tended are timekeepers. Barns that are toppling over are timekeepers. And, a landfill is a timekeeper. And I was fascinated when I saw that it's one of the highest landfills it's right on the banks of the Raritan River, just along the Jersey Turnpike. And it's an active, we're building it as one of our proud production, creations right now. It will outlast all of us in this room by many, many thousands of years. And I sent them an email saying to the Edgeboro landfill, or the Middlesex Utility Authority or whatever. And they said, yeah, sure, we'd love to see you here. Let us know when you come. And I arrived, and they gave me a walking tour to the top of the landfill. And as I write in the book, about a year before that, I had been to the Grand Canyon. And if you go to the Grand Canyon and start to walk down one of the trails, like the South Kebab Trail that takes you to the river, within about 10 minutes, you've walked out of all of human recorded history in terms of the accumulation of sediment. The landfill, so you're walking back in time, and you go about 1.9 billion years before you get to the river, which, as I say in the book, is, of course, the present. But at the landfill, it was exactly the opposite. I was walking up in time. And so when we were going up at one point, I said to the guy I was walking with, I said, what year was this, do you think? And he said, I think it was about 2006. And we had started in the Eisenhower administration. They had started this thing in the Eisenhower administration. And the great thing about it is that it had originally been a hole that they dug to get the sand to build the turnpike. And the sand pit then became a burial mound. And one of the other great moments was when we were walking up, I said to the guy, out in the Ohio River Valley, out in Mississippi River, all the way up to Wisconsin, there are these mounds that the mound builders built. I was acting as if I was telling him something he didn't know. He was a mound builder himself. And he said, oh, I know, I went to Ohio State. I used to go to the Great Serpent Mound all the time. He then went on this whole great little discussion about how those people built these mounds for sacred purposes, for all kinds of reasons, actually. And then he said, we, on the other hand, we're brutal. We're just filling these with trash. And this was a whole valley, essentially. There were all kinds of now extinct landfills there that were dormant, done, finished. And it was a kind of a ghastly chapter in some ways, but I found it, I wouldn't say uplifting, but when I got up there, it was the first tiny glimmer I had of Manhattan. And it was sort of perfect that I would get from that highest promontory my first glimpse of where I was going.
It's a fantastic chapter. Another fantastic chapter, and I only have two more questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Close to the end, you have a chapter called Rapture on the Bayonne Bridge. What is going on there? Can you read a little bit for us?
Yeah, one thing I'll just mention quickly. I was doing these dispatches, which Helene mentioned along the way. So every morning I would wake up and I would send an email about the previous day to a growing roster of people that got to be several hundred. And on one of the days, I had this amazing experience in a bar where I went in. It was pouring rain outside, and I sat at the bar and I ordered some fish tacos and I ordered a beer. And I sat there and I drank some of the beer. And it was almost as if I'd been struck by lightning. I had just this incredible surge of joy, just like kind of rapturous joy. The kind of joy that you're almost sort of like heaving with the happiness. And when it came time to writing about this, I was hesitant. I was like, should I really describe this for people? It sounds a little strange. What are people going to think? And it's not easy. Like, our language is actually struggles to find the words for that zone of the emotional spectrum. We're so good at the darker side, the anxieties, the depressions. We're not that good. I don't know why, but the language is kind of more difficult on the other side. So I had a lot of these moments, and it kind of came to a head, which I'll just read a little bit to explain sort of the why of it, which is actually, I don't really know the total why of it, but this was when I was in Staten Island and I was going to cross the Bayonne Bridge to get back into Bayonne and then get up to Jersey City, because going back to the colonial times, that's how people went from Philadelphia to Manhattan. They had to stick to the hard ground, not the swampy Meadowlands ground. So they would go to Perth Amboy, cross to Staten Island, up, across anyway, so that's why I was doing this. As I went, day after day, opening myself to the people and places I encountered, I became in turn more open to those people and places, more in tune, more in sync, as Ted had predicted in his driveway on that third morning of the walk. Absent the otherworld distractions buried in our phones or laptops, I could feel my capacity for awe and wonder grow exponentially with the days. All that I came to care about was what I saw around me, the people I met, the little shifts in culture or barn design, the texture of the land I crossed, the nuances of the forests or the farms. I tried to care about that with all the energies usually spent on caring about more distant and abstract things. It was, I suppose, an effort to grant preeminence to place, to make the present truly immediate, to have it stripped as much as possible of all unnecessary mediation, to have attention, as the good poet said, be the beginning of devotion. Perhaps that helps explain why, when I stepped out onto the initial incline, going up the huge sweep of the Bayonne Bridge, the sight of the Manhattan skyline hit me with a physical force. I hadn't been looking for the city. I had my eyes at my feet. I was thinking of other things. Then I raised my head while walking up the ramp, the wind coming strong and bracing from the north, and the sudden sight of the city's jagged towers and the sparkle of the river above the Richmond rooftops washed over me like an ocean wave.
Spoiler alert, Neil makes it to New York. I was so excited when you were on that boat crossing the Hudson River. Take us with you. Put us there. This is my last question, then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. But can you first at least describe a little bit about what that boat ride was like? And then can you read one passage from the last chapter on what you got out of this walk?
Okay. I was going to kayak across the Hudson with a guy that I had found, sort of online, and had reached out to a guy named Kevin Murray, who was really a great character. And he had gone to school at St. Peter's, I think it's called, in in Jersey City. And then a mutual friend of ours, Phil Kuntz, who formerly at the Journal, had come down as well. And in the end, I couldn't take the kayak. It was too much wind, and the surf was up. And he got me across in a Boston whaler. So when we were going across the river, we were all recounting our own September 11th memories. Kevin, who was a lot younger, had seen it all play out from his high school right there. Phil had been at the hotel right next door to the Trade Center and had seen all of the horrors firsthand. I had been in Washington covering all that. Actually, I was one of 2 terrorism reporters at the time. And and after, when I finally got to Manhattan, I then walked to the World Trade Center Memorial, and I write a whole sort of passage about it being the first memorial that I'd really encountered on the entire walk that was of, deeply felt significance to me. And I kind of was just astonished at my own level of how moved I was by it, the memory of the Cantor Fitzgerald, just the incredible numbers of people who had died, the extraordinary number of first responders. I mean, these are all things that we know, right? We remember, but I guess it was just standing there like, wow, like 460 people came into the horrors of that morning and went up those staircases and died as a result. And I don't know, it was giving yourself the moment to remember and to feel these things that have otherwise become obvious. I'm just going to read a tiny bit about kind of the what did it all mean. Friends asked what I had learned. This is by the time I got home. I called it the post-amble. And I tried to explain. If you go out your front door with an eye for all that baffles, amazes, enchants, and keep at it day after day, giving into the landscape and letting the rhythm of your steps guide you, it's astonishing what can ensue. Within days, you understand why the holy books have whole sections built around the stories, the one-off encounters of men and women out walking. Very particular things, a sermon by a man out getting his trash can, the hand-forged hinges on an old barn, how the maples flower, then leaf, acquire very particular meanings. They tell stories that weave together into a riddle that is long and flowing and difficult to explain, should you feel the compulsion to explain. You bring meaning with you when you go looking for meaning, and the more of it you bring, the more you get in return. What you find is often fragmentary and slippery. Our histories, personal, tribal, national, are mosaics of broken pieces and shards of tile and stone. They contain within them, perhaps in equal measure, order and disorder, reason and randomness. Some sections are bright and shimmery, others grimy, unsettling, hard to decipher. Shame and love can mingle. The love you feel for your country can deepen along with the knowledge of the shameful things we've done. There is ugliness, but also beauty in the ugliness. What we remember of an era may reflect more than anything our desire to give it the best gloss.
Then go get in line. If you guys have questions and you're not going to be like Gardner Harris and shout at me from the rafters, there's a line there's a microphone right up here.
Right there.
Right where you are.
Right
You're
here.
the first one,
So
yeah.
I'm in the first one?
Yeah, go for it.
There's a Luddite aspect to your book a little bit. I mean, you hate, you hate the cars, you love the Mennonites. And I just, I wasn't clear, did you ever listen to music? Did you listen to podcasts? When you walk now, do you try to do it without your phone? Like, talk to us about, because you talked about how important it was to be alone, and of course these devices in our pockets make sure that we're never alone. So talk about what you have learned, what you learned about technology, and what you do now on your walks that you learned about through doing this?
I mean, I will never disparage one of these phone gadgets because they're so extraordinary. We need to rename them. They're not actually phones. They do everything. That's kind of the least important thing they do. I never listened to a bit of music. I never listened to a podcast. I never listened to an audio. I'd never put anything in my ears. And that was quite, not just intentional, but, I don't know about the rest of you, but I find my own thoughts to be pretty entertaining while out walking. By the way, if I'm just out walking the neighborhood, I will cram my ears with all kinds of podcasts. I'm a huge believer in that as a form of education. It's like going back to college for me. So I'm not a Luddite in that way at all. But in this case, it was very, very much about having my own thoughts and taking things in. It's fascinating. I used the phone. Of course, this is about to be replaced in a huge way by all the AI, which this is a primitive form of AI, but just with the notes function in iPhone, and I would open it and I would dictate things to myself while walking down the road, thoughts or some account of some encounter I just had. And that was the raw material for the dispatches I did every day. And that was in turn the raw material for the book, which is to say, I think probably 10% of the book or so was basically written while walking, because a lot of those sentences in some form made it into the book. And I wanted to kind of keep that sort of walker's pace of thought and the semi-informality of how things just come to you. The challenge at the start of writing it was just try to write a book that any of you will open and say, I'm going to go on a walk with this guy all the way to New York and just listen to what he has to say. That's because that's what it is. And you just have to be engaging enough for somebody to want to do that. So that was my effort.
There's a bunch of people. Are you guys standing in line for the? There's a. Are you?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm full disclosure, lucky enough and fortunate enough to be a friend of both Neil and Helene's. And first, an apology for every single one of those tape of all the songs that I sent you, because I realized after reading all of your dispatches, you had absolutely no time to listen to any of the crap I was sending to you, so my apologies on that front. A couple of questions I've gotten, and this has just literally been over the last couple of days. And you may have already answered this. I'm halfway through your book right now. The title itself, did that come to you, or did you already have it in your mind when you first set out? Because I actually think that I might have been the first or last person of your circle before you took off, because you stopped by the house and then I just saw you wander off into Rock Creek Park and had no idea whether I'd see you again. So,
I had much more literary titles. I was, but of course the title fashion at the moment is like 2-word, it sounds like a movie or something like that. So and I'm not even saying this is a good title, but going back to my original thing that the book was in part about time, I think one of my working titles was Time Interrupted. People were like, I'm not reading that book. But some of it was about my time. All of our time had been interrupted by COVID, by everything else. But also my assertion, which I get to a bit when I talk about the seams, that it's incumbent on us to interrupt our own time and to create kind of what I look at as extraordinary time, kind of time outside of time, which is what this walk was very much for me.
where did you feel most at home, and where did you feel most not? Or where did you feel most uncomfortable?
I don't know whether I ever felt really particularly uncomfortable anywhere. I don't know. I mean, I certainly, people, Gardner's going to think I'm even more of a Luddite. I said I felt most at home among the Anabaptists, But I love, I was just back up there. It is one of the most dangerous places to drive because it's just mind-bogglingly gorgeous. I was driving back the other night along this curvy road. This is in the heart of like Amish Mennonite area. And these houses, they'll be like 3 stories high, made of stone, and they'll have the little illuminated candle lights in each of the windows, and you'll just be like, what? And the silos, and just that whole area is just sort of shockingly beautiful, I think. When it comes to human designed natural beauty or human designed beauty, that's pretty up there. I don't know. I guess I would say that area in a way. I loved walking down the Delaware Canal path, which I'm sure a few of you have done, which is also quite amazing.
Last question.
Wow.
Do I get one more? Okay.
Yes.
All right, thanks. We were taking a walk around Washington maybe about 2 weeks before you took off, and you were just sort of getting used to your pack and so forth. And we came right near the Frederick Douglass Bridge. We came across sort of a mini Mount Trashmore. But before that, we had passed some homeless people living in tents who had masks on their face. And I remember that distinctly, you mentioning to me, wow, just how far this pandemic had permeated into the culture, where you actually have people who are living in tents wearing masks. Did you get a sense of that, or as you got farther away from Washington, did you feel more comfortable, more sort of like this is a million people had died, but people were moving on? Or?
You have to remember, the end of March of 2021, almost all of us had been vaccinated. We actually thought at that moment that we were walking out of COVID. Like
Right.
the masks were actually coming off and places were opening, or I wouldn't have taken the walk. I was going to take it exactly the year before, and it became impossible. So the mask thing was not really even a feature of the walk, which is kind of helpful because now that the book has come out, I think there are only maybe 2 or 3 mentions of masks. If it had been too overly kind of COVID-y, it would have kind of dated it somewhat. I mean, that spring was actually very similar to this spring, except this spring we're just completely, thankfully, more or less out of it. So, yeah.
It's a great book. Thank you.
Oh, were those guys waiting? You guys waiting? Okay, yeah.
Who's not waiting? But you two are waiting. So I'm after you.
So thank you. And David Axelrod's interview was great.
Thank you.
You've mentioned, in your vocabulary, you've used evangelizing, devotion, parables of, and if I were Krista Tippett, I'd probably say, could you tell us something about, the faith tradition or whatever you grew up with, or maybe one that you're involved with today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And if you're Krista Tippett, I would be on your podcast, which I absolutely love, by the way. It's that's a powerhouse in my mind. I'm a Catholic by upbringing. I'm not like a big Bible reader. It's sort of part of my heritage. I was fascinated myself how quickly this walk became religious in ways that I hadn't really expected it to. And there were some really kind of magical moments. One of them I was, when I stopped and these Mennonite kids ended up inviting me into their school and sang some hymns to me. And at the end of that, they went upstairs and I asked their teacher, I said, tell me a little bit about the Mennonite faith. And he said, well, we're basically about we're about non-resistance and non-conformism. The second principle he explained using a line from St. Paul to the Romans, which I'd never heard before, but the line was, do not conform to the world, but transform yourself through a renewal of your mind. And when he said that to me, he kept talking, and this happened several times on the walk where it would take like 30 seconds for something to sink in, and then I would say, wait a minute, whoa, wait, go back to that thing you just said about letter to the Roman. And when he said it again, I was like, wow, this is a line that goes back like 2,000 years, and it was kind of a motto in a way for the walk. That idea of don't just let the world form you, make it an active thing to transform yourself through a renewing of your mind. And that later when I was talking to a Quaker, and he brought up something that he called the second naivete, and I said, wait, what's the second naivete? And he said, it's an idea by a philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, about if you're so lucky as to have like a second go at childhood later in life, and you can kind of shed some of your proud predispositions to thinking you know all kinds of things and go at the world as if in a fresh way. And I said, wow, I think I'm going through a second naivete. I love that idea, by the way.
We have 5 more minutes. I see 3 people I definitely think we need to get in. 1, 2, 3. And I think after the young lady there, we're going to cut it off. So.
Did you have a personal safety plan prepared in advance of your journey? And if so, could you sort of describe it a little bit?
Gosh, I wish I were the kind of person that had a personal safety plan.
Meaning, did you have someone track you, or did you give your itinerary to someone so that in the event that there was some sort of issue where maybe you didn't have your phone or you lost it or something happened
That's
to
a really
you?
good question.
It is a really good question. Yeah, I realize I'm really like that. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I talk to my wife most days, probably all days. I didn't have my tracking device on, or nor did I ever give her an itinerary. I think she kind of knew generally where I was, but no. Dang, I feel bad now.
So basically, if you like hit your head or something like that, nobody would know where to find you.
No, there's a lot of roadkill along the roads. There's all kinds of roadkill.
Two questions. The first one is, before you started out, what did you hope to find, and did you find it? And the second question is a little bit more prosaic. How much did this cost you?
Yeah, it's not as cheap. Well, it would have been a lot cheaper if I decided not to stay in places that averaged about, $110 a night or something like that. So, 26 nights. I did stay with some friends. It definitely, all told, had to have cost close to $2,000, I guess, probably. It's a month long, so it's not that bad. I mean, I was living off submarine sandwiches and stuff. Like, it wasn't a foodie experience. What did I expect to find? I really I didn't go with a particular expectation. I went really as an exercise in observation. And I really wanted to just see the particulars of things in really detailed ways and have enough time to absorb them as such. And in that regard, I definitely found what I went looking for because, and I had planned a lot. A lot of the people I met along the way I had planned to meet. They were important. But to the extent that you also plan on things not happening that you hope will really enrich the whole of it, there was so much of that I still am amazed at the things that happened that I hadn't planned for.
Did you experience any environmental phenomena or extreme temperatures or in relationship to, I don't know if it influenced your understanding of the global climate crisis or?
That's a good question. I'm glad I'm not walking right now, for instance, because it was when I was walking 2 years ago, and it's just markedly hotter than it was 2 years ago. Just, these things are, and I was also lucky that spring that year in 2021 had been delayed by about 2 weeks, and, where it's all the measures of what are the forsythia doing, what are the dogwood doing, all that kind of stuff. And I had the privilege of walking through a spring and walking the leaf line the whole way. It was such an amazing thing to watch it play out. One day, I had about 3 hours of sort of slanting snow, which were fantastic, and I had one of these bizarre bolts of joy as a result, I guess. And I had a few days of fairly heavy rain, but never enough that changed my plans. And those, in a way, were sort of welcome. I was very lucky that, April can be a really tumultuous time of year when you're walking up along there. Anybody that's done the Appalachian Trail will know these huge storms can come in across the Appalachians. And I didn't get there. It wasn't a super stormy April, and I was lucky for that. I guess the showrunner has probably said we need to move on to the next thing, but I'm just so, this has been so much fun, and to see, oh gosh, I should take a picture of you all. Hold this, I gotta do this. Thank you anyway.